Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. Today, we are so pleased to welcome one of our own here. Our fellow member, Ken Fettig, is here. He's going to share some knowledge today on the Crusades. Today, Ken was born and raised in Boston, but he has been in Walpole for the past 50 or so years, I think. Been very involved in Walpole. I think a lot of you probably know him. In his working years, he tells me that he started out in the nuclear industry and then ran a company selling advertising promotional items. It wasn't until his retirement that Ken pursued his interest in history and education. He actually started the lifelong learning program at Tufts University, which now has about 600 members. And he taught a number of classes there, which includes Born Elsewhere, Living Here, World War II in the Pacific, and Between the Wars. Today, Ken will be talking about the Crusades, and he tells me this topic is usually presented in a course that includes several classes. So today he's going to do an introduction, and hopefully we can tempt him to come back and talk more about the Crusades at a later date, and maybe some of these other topics as well. So join me in welcoming Ken Fettig. Thank you.
Thank you. Debbie, is everybody strapped on their armor and sharpened their swords? The definition that medieval historians would use of the Crusades is an armed expedition leaving from Central Europe with the intention of going to the Holy Land and freeing Jerusalem. And there were 8 of them conducted in a period from 1097 to 1271, I believe, about 2 centuries. And as a introduction, how the Crusades got started, in the period when Christ was alive, the whole of the Mediterranean was under the control of the Roman Empire, down to Spain, even up in England, out into the Holy Land, and they controlled major cities on the south coast as well. And the Roman Empire at the time was not Christian, and matter of fact, Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor of Jerusalem at the time of Christ's death and sentenced him to death. So the Roman Empire was definitely not Christian at the time. The empire split in about 350 AD, and a western section was under the control of Rome, and the east under the control of a emperor in a city which came to be known after him, Constantinople. And they were the eastern flank of the Roman Empire. Constantine's mother became a Christian and converted him, and he eventually became a very strong Christian, and between them they made it possible for people to go from Europe through a series of cities controlled by Constantine to the Holy Land on pilgrimage. So he was a a really deciding factor in the growth of Christianity in the East. Unfortunately, for him, the people that followed him as emperors weren't as good administrators as he was, and eventually they began to lose land to the newly formed Islam Empire. Muhammad actually, according to the handout, was born in 570, and he was a merchant, went to Jerusalem on business, and was taken up to the skies and consulted with the ancient fathers, and came back with the book of tenets that control the Muslim church. And the Muslims grew very fast, and they took over the south coast of the Mediterranean all the way to Morocco and then up into Spain. And they were only stopped at the Pyrenees Mountains. So Spain and Portugal stayed Muslim for several years. The Muslims eventually took over Jerusalem, but the early days there was significant cooperation between the three churches: the Islam, Catholicism, and Judaism. Finally, however, around the end of the first millennium, they took control of the city of Jerusalem and the east coast of the Mediterranean. In the meantime, in 1054, there was a schism in the church, and the bishops in Rome and Constantinople disagreed, and they ended up excommunicating each other. So the Eastern Rite of the Catholic Church was born in around 1050. In the meantime, there was a battle between the eastern group of the Roman Empire and the Seljuk Turks, who had come down and joined with the Muslims. The Muslims decisively defeated the troops from Constantinople and gradually started taking over Turkey, what's known as Turkey nowadays. And they came over here, and this is Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and they took over the city of Nicaea. And it's really only about 100 miles from Constantinople, but there is the Straits of Bosporus in between, so there was some protection for Constantinople. However, the emperor was concerned that they might try to take over Constantinople, so he contacted the Pope and asked for some help. The Pope at the time was meeting in Lombardy with a group of bishops, and they discussed the possibility of helping out Constantinople. and they decided that it was be a good idea because it would offer them the opportunity to heal the rift between the two sections of the church. And he went on from there to another meeting, a much larger one in Cluny in southeastern France. And there was a nobleman there who was quite friendly with the Pope, and the Pope talked to him about it, and Raymond decided that maybe they ought to answer the call. And so the Pope met with the bishops in Cluny and told them about it, and they all agreed. And then he went to an open air meeting with the populace in the area and discussed the prospect. And he ended up by shouting, Deus vult, meaning God wills it, and that they should go on crusade and help the people in Constantinople. And the idea caught on, and several noblemen in the France initially and then Germany signed on. And the Pope realized that this was going to be a big expedition and therefore needed some rules. And one was that they would not leave until the fall harvest was completed. And then young men, married men, could not go because they had to populate the church. And so, they never offered me that one. They went after me in the draft. The rules were set, and eventually about 7 noblemen signed up. Oh, and one condition was that they would have 3 months of supplies so that the territory they were going through on the way to Turkey, Turkey would not be devastated. Then that was why the only noblemen who could afford this put groups together. However, there was one recalcitrant by the name of Peter the Hermit. And Peter was a itinerant preacher and walked around France recruiting people to join the church. And he took the oath to join the Crusades and gathered a large bunch of people. And you wonder why anyone would join with Peter and leave the farm and go. And you have to realize in those days, people's lifespan was 40, 45, 50 years. And if you were a second or third or fourth son, you weren't ever going to inherit anything. And therefore, this sounded like a pretty good adventure. And most of them have never been maybe 15, 20 miles away from their home. So Peter gathered this large group. He got up into Germany, and they were about to start out, and of course they had no funds. And he went to the local authorities and asked for help, and didn't get it because is kind of a disorganized mob. And so they attacked the Jewish communities in those cities. And those were the first pogroms of many that were conducted against Jews in the Eastern Europe. The mob took off down the Rhine River and over into the valley of the Danube, and along the way they were scavenging from farms and so forth, and became very unpopular. Finally, when they got to Constantinople, the emperor shipped them right away over the Bosporus into Turkey. And they were getting organized to attack Nicaea. And the Nicaeans, who were very capable warriors, came out and slaughtered the whole bunch of them. Very few of them survived. Now, it was a downer as far as the Crusades go, but on the other hand, it helped in an odd sort of way in that the people from the Turks in the eastern area of Turkey concluded that if that's the best they can do, we don't have much to worry about. So they didn't prepare for the big crusades which are about to come. The Crusaders eventually got there late in the year and wintered over in Constantinople and then started out in the spring. They went over and attacked Nicaea, and they managed to capture the city after an assault of about 2 weeks. Now, I should have mentioned right at the beginning that in those days, gunpowder had not reached the European areas, and therefore armaments consisted mostly of hand weapons and bows and arrows. And as a result, it was pretty easy to defend a city by building walls around the city. And if you Google walled cities, you'd be amazed to find that there was over 800 of them in Europe, 300 alone in France. So, excuse me, when a city was attacked, they simply pulled into the walled area, lifted the gate, and they were safe for the moment anyhow. The way they were attacked was with what was known as siege engines and catapults. The siege engine was basically a large ladder complex that they could roll up to the wall and protect themselves from weapons or oil coming over the edge of the wall. And the catapult was a device that would throw a large rock against the wall and hopefully break it down. Without the siege engine, it was pretty hard to get up there and take a ram and knock down the wall. But there are various ways of attacking a walled city, and the Crusaders got pretty good at it by the time they were finished. They went on from there and had one more major battle on the Turkish mainland Incidentally, it was known as Byzantium then rather than Turkey. But they went across Turkey, and without too much of a problem, they came all the way to this area where east, the east coast of the Mediterranean comes in. And there was a city there by the name of Antioch. And Antioch had a very strong defensive setup. There was a river that went by one side. It was hilly on two sides, and therefore they were able to resist the Crusaders for a period of over 2 months. And during that period, a couple of the groups that had signed on to the Crusades left, so they were losing momentum. And there was a leader by the name of Bohemond, who was actually I guess you could call it a Northern European, maybe a Viking, who belonged to a large group under Ronald Gustard, who was a famous Viking leader, and he had participated at one point in attacking Constantinople, but got repulsed. But Bohemond came up with a scheme to take Antioch, and it involved pretending that the crusade was breaking up and having people start to leave the site. And then he bribed one of the guards at the one of the gates, and went in overnight, and they managed to get a group through the gate and open it up for the rest of the crusade group, and they went in and pillaged the city, as was the custom at the time, and took over. And within a month, a large group of Muslim warriors showed up, and Bohemond actually led the Crusaders out before they got before the Muslims got organized, and drove them off. And so they were secure for that winter period, and they finally got together and planned the next leg of the trip, which was down the east coast of the Mediterranean, down towards Jerusalem. They had some internal problems getting together, and not all the group left at the same time, but eventually they did, and they were fortunate that the trading ships from Italy and southern France were working in this area, and they began to supply them with food and extra weapons and so forth. So they were very successful in coming down the coast and getting eventually to Bethlehem. However, Jerusalem was also a very difficult city to storm, and the forces in Jerusalem poisoned the wells between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, so they had no water. They had to bring it with them, and then they burned all the wood that they could find in that area, so that the siege engines could not be built. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I guess, a Venetian ship was captured by the Muslim Navy ship and had to ground on the coast near Haifa. So they broke that ship up and were able to bring the wood up so that they could build these siege engines. They finally got a couple of siege engines built and attacked the north and west walls, and eventually broke into the city. And in the meantime, all the Christians had been sent out of the city, so there were just Muslims and Jews left in the city. Of course, they sacked the city and they killed the inhabitants, and one chronicler wrote that the horses' hooves were covered in blood. There was so much in the streets. And ironically, the Crusaders, after the last of the fighting ended, held a mass to celebrate their triumph. And immediately they heard that a group was coming up from Egypt to help in the defense of Jerusalem, and they went out and beat them off, so they secured their victory in Jerusalem. And they didn't have long to celebrate. There was plenty of pressure from the Muslims after that. Now the big problem came when they had to decide on leadership. And Raymond of Toulouse was by far the most, the richest of the group, and had provided for them along the way to a large extent. But he was not a popular person, so they elected Stephen of my 90-year-old memory is not always that great. Godfrey of Boulogne was elected. He shortly passed away, and his brother, who had founded the first of the Crusade counties, on the way down, he became the actually the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin the First. Stephen didn't wish to take the title king. He thought it was a little beyond him, but Baldwin was not so reluctant. Now, you might notice on the page that shows the Crusades themselves in order, that there are two things to notice between the first and the third Crusade. First is the time period. The second Crusade did not come along until 40 or more years later, and then the third another 40. Now, even though these crusaders were sometimes in their 20s, that means they're pretty much in their 60s by the time the Second Crusade was necessary. And what brought it about? Well, the Muslims attacked an area near one of the principal cities of the new Crusade states. Actually, by this time, there were 4 Crusader states, starting with Antioch, where they had established themselves, and then Tyre and Edessa and Jerusalem. So they were in danger of being attacked, and here's the second thing you might notice between the First and Third Crusades. The First Crusades were all noblemen, or the leaders. The second and third were all kings. No kings had been involved in the First Crusade. Not sure why there was a good explanation of that, but in any event, King Louis of France and King Conrad were persuaded to come and help the Crusaders free up the area around Edessa. They both arrived at Constantinople, but in different times, and they set out at different times. Neither one crossed Byzantium or Turkey very well, and they lost a lot of troops. So they eventually came to the shore and took boats to get to Antioch. When they got to Antioch, the King Louis, who was traveling with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was probably the most famous woman in European history up to that point. She took up with his the head of Antioch, and Louis thought, well, I'm going to get her out of here. So they left and went to Jerusalem, and they decided instead to attack the city of Damascus, which on your map, which is included in there, you'll see is quite close to Jerusalem. Incidentally, the map has all kinds of information on it. However, it's in French. So, but they put together an assault on Damascus, which wasn't successful. And Louis withdrew, Conrad withdrew, and therefore the Second Crusade was pretty much a failure. Then several years later, another 40 years or so, Richard the Lionhearted, King Philip II of Germany, or France, France. Richard was sort of the king of, well, he ended up as the king of England. However, in his whole lifetime, he spent about 6 months in England. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, which is in southeast France. He had inherited some lands in France, and he pretty much stayed there. So the three of them set out, and now they kind of wised up and found that it was safer to take a boat from Constantinople to Jerusalem. Now the area going down goes through Cyprus, and Cyprus was held by a Muslim leader, and Richard heard that one of his ships was shipwrecked on Cyprus, and that the crew was treated badly. So he debarked and conquered Cyprus on the way. So now the three of them joined up, and they started down the east coast of the Mediterranean, and they approached Jerusalem the same way. In the meantime, Jerusalem had been taken by Saladin, famous Muslim leader, and they were able to come to sort of a truce, and Richard found out, well, in the meantime, Richard had driven off Philip, and King Frederick had died on the way, so Richard was pretty much in charge, and he and Saladin struck a deal where Catholics could have access to Jerusalem, and he had to get back because he heard that his brother was maneuvering to take over his kingship. So the results of the Third Crusade were quite inconclusive, and Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands after that. Then about 10 years later, a bunch of earls and other nobles decided that they couldn't leave the situation the way it was. They had to retake Jerusalem. And they went to Venice to hire boats to take them to the Holy Land, and they also wanted to take their horses with them so that they would have a combined army that was quite large and mobile. The Doge of Venice, like the mayor, basically, decided that he would do it, but for a price. So he built the ships. The noblemen couldn't come up with all the money to afford it, so he made a deal with them to attack a city along the Adriatic, so that this was a Christian city, and Venice competed with them on a commercial basis. So he wanted them to get sort of wiped out or downsized. So he persuaded them to attack this city, and they did. And as they were approaching the walls of the city, the residents were hanging crosses over the wall and all. Didn't matter. They took the city. And in the process, they also heard from the son of a leader from Constantinople that had been deposed, and he convinced them that if they took him back to Constantinople, they would be welcomed with open arms, and he could get money and ships to complete the voyage to the Holy Land. They went on to Constantinople, and the prince stood up on the front of the ship and waved to the citizens and was met by a series of arrows. So now they now the Crusaders were stuck on the shore of Constantinople without the funds or the ability to do much of anything to get back to home or to get to the Holy Land. So they attacked Constantinople, and they succeeded in taking it, and they appointed one of them as the new emperor of Constantinople, carved up a lot of the property that Constantinople owned among them, and incidentally, how many of you have been to Venice? Well, remember those gilded horses on the church? They came from Constantinople. They sold all these. Constantinople was probably the richest and best kept city in Europe at the time. They took all those things and shipped them back to Venice. And some people say that probably that started the Renaissance, that they saw what was accomplished in Constantinople, and therefore it could be done in Europe as well. But the end result was the Fourth Crusade was a fiasco, and it not only ended in disaster in two cities, two Catholic cities, but also took away the possibility that Constantinople would now be a stopping ground for approaching the Holy Land. Now, the focus then turned to perhaps approaching the Holy Land from the Egyptian side. And so the Fifth Crusade was arranged to go through Egypt. And they had hoped to recruit Frederick II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, to lead the crusade. He decided that he had more important things to do in Europe, and he declined to go. And he was excommunicated by the Pope, by the way. John Brienne, who was ensconced in one of the Crusader states, and King Leopold of Austria and Andre of Hungary signed on, and they went to Egypt. They landed in a place called Damasia, in here, and started up the coast. But they found that the going was tough. They couldn't get any supplies in, and eventually the crusade kind of petered out. Uh, then the Sixth Crusade, Frederick finally showed up, and he went to, landed on the eastern Mediterranean, led his troops up, and at the time, the Muslim leader made an arrangement with Frederick that he could have equal access to Jerusalem, and so Frederick took the deal and left. And I guess you could say he retook Jerusalem, but there were no battles, and he was totally unpopular amongst the people of Palestine in that area. And that ended that crusade. Then King Louis IX organized the Seventh Crusade, and once again, they were going through Egypt, and he was pretty successful, and they got to the point where they were within striking distance of Cairo, and unfortunately the spring rains came, and he was marooned and captured, and he was ransomed by the Egyptians, and of course that ended that crusade. And then the final one, he left again, stopped in Tunis to recharge their provisions, and died in Tunis, and the crusade was called off. So the Crusaders had about 40 to 60 years of occupancy in Jerusalem, which was the original plan, and the rest of the Crusader states, the other three states, were eventually taken, and finally in 1271 the final Crusaders left the continent. So, good story, bad story. Any questions? Yes.
Was there a children's crusade? Was there a children's crusade?
Yes, yeah. There's, I don't know whether I published that or not, but the enthusiasm for Crusades after the second one was way down, and the Pope had to offer consolation prizes of sorts. So they organized a crusade to free Spain, which eventually became successful. They had one against the pagans. And then there was that awful thing which you mentioned about the Children's Crusade. And this young individual persuaded a lot of young people to join him and go on crusade and take back the Holy Land. And he marched through Germany, down into Italy, or to France, and some unscrupulous ship owners managed to ship them over to the coast of Africa, and they disappeared. And there was another young man who did the same thing, but he didn't get his people over to Africa. And there was a crusade in Northern Europe at the same time, and that was against the Wends, which were, pardon me?
You said against the what?
Wends, Wenddt, I think. But those were partially successful, and they didn't involve getting on a ship and going for 2 years foreign land. So, yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
After 1271, after the last crusade,
Yeah.
was there relatively between the three groups in the Palestine area?
Was there peace in the area? Is that? Well, I guess you could call it that. Various Muslim rulers were more aggressive than others, but it wasn't until the 1500s that Catholics really had access to the Holy Land again. Yes.
Was the first crusade the only one that actually went by land all the way to Jerusalem from Central Europe?
Yes. Yeah.
Were any of the others
Yeah.
verse the same?
Well, the second one, Louis got to Jerusalem, and the third, they didn't quite get there, but they made a truce that they could go to the city if they wanted to. Yes.
Were all these popes, were they descendants of St. Peter, and were they faithful to Christianity?
Were they faithful to?
Christianity.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, Jerry.
The question is, I noticed that all the crusades were basically called by the Pope, and then they were supported by a cadre of different people. In fact, was it funded by the Pope, or did these various groups form their own source of income to drive these people? And secondly, when you go across the
Wait a minute. Let me get closer.
My question, Norm, is were all the Crusades driven
Yeah.
by the Pope? In other words, did he raise his hand
Yes,
and say,
yes.
"We're going"?
Yeah.
When he said "we're going," did he fund them, or in fact, did the cadre of people who went, did they fund it?
Yeah, he recruited people that could afford to go.
Now,
But
when they went,
Yeah.
when they, particularly what Alan brought up, when they crossed the vast group of land, how did they supply and support the groups of fighters?
well, the First Crusade, the Emperor of Constantinople offered them help. Matter of fact, he offered them his troops as well. Unfortunately, when they took Nicaea, they didn't allow the Crusaders to sack the city, so they had bad public relations with the after that. Yeah.
So the last crusade, the eighth, I noticed that wasn't called by the Pope. Just King Louis decided that he was going to.
Yeah.
And he did it without any support from the church, basically. He
Well,
was for the church, but
Yeah. He was supported, but he smarted after losing his chance in Egypt, and if he the headman in Egypt offered him a deal to take Jerusalem, but he persisted in attacking
He
the
ended
city.
up dying, and
Yeah,
all the Crusaders went home.
yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes. Pardon me?
Was Eleanor of Aquitaine actually in any of the battles?
No, no. And she was a bit of a bother. She held court on the way, and they had to have fancy meals and yeah. Yes.
How many people were involved in these crusades? How many people?
Good question. The first crusade had the most, and I have a sheet which I can leave with you, but it shows the number of knights that, and like Godfrey of Bouillon had 10,000 knights, 25,000 foot soldiers. Bohemond, 5 to 10,000. Raymond of St. Giles, he was the most 10 to 15,000 knights, 10,000 foot soldiers. Now that's another thing, you know, the traveling during this period had to be at foot speed, so the most you could probably make in a day was 20 miles or 25. Yes, yeah. Yeah. It's a sheet that shows that. I don't think that was included in the other. Anybody else? Well, ungird your loins and put the swords away.